Welcome to the ParentNet podcast by Focus on the Family Singapore. In each episode, we will be speaking with everyday parents and practitioners as they share with us gems from their parenthood journey. Keep tuning in to learn with us as we figure it out together.
Hello, my name is Joshua, and I'll be your host for this episode. The conversation about sex and relationship can be delicate and tricky, and not to mention nerve-wracking. Yet as parents, I think we know it is our responsibility to teach our children, rather than to have them learn through social media or their peers. Parents need to be the first source of information. That's why we are launching the series on Talk About Sex. And today's topic, how do we help our children understand the purpose of sex? And we have here today Michelle Soon, mother of one, as our guest today. So she's an educator and she's also passionate about sexuality education. So hello, Michelle, and welcome to this episode focusing on talking about sex, an important topic. So to get us started, can you basically tell us a little bit about yourself and your family?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Joshua, for having me. So I myself come from a family of 5. I have 2 other siblings. I'm the eldest. My mom was a stay-at-home mom. And part of that means that I'm also naturally more inclined to be a stay-at-home mom, and I had the privilege of doing that for the first 3 years for my son's life. We were overseas because of my husband's work deployment. So that 3 years as a stay-at-home mom was deeply transformative for me. I keep thinking back to it as the basis for my current relationship with my son. The fact that we're so close, I really attribute it to that first 3 years I had with him exclusively.
That is so important. I think the bond, right, I'm sure is spilling over to the relationship that you have with him right now. And hopefully it will still be the same as he enters into the adolescent years, And so talking about the topic for today, right, Michelle, I mean, you imagine this scenario. You mentioned earlier that you just watched Where Do Babies Come From video from our series and Talk About Sex website. And that has given you, I guess, that common language between your son and you, especially when it comes to the topic of sexuality. But the question is, what if, your child asks the question on what is sex for, the purpose of sex? How would you respond to that question?
To answer the question of what sex is for, we need to first understand what sex is. And I think that there's a need to set the record straight because our culture and our media has changed and often distorted our views on what sex is. And they continue to change and distort. It's not like it has stopped. It continues to evolve, right? So I think for the record, sex is the complementary joining of a man and a woman's body with the potential to bring forth new life. And there's nothing casual about it at all. Our culture does tell us today that, there's such a thing as casual sex. And I blame it on the invention of the pill, which is a kind of oral contraception back in the 1950s. It has de-linked sex with babies. And that's the reason why I think it is so easy to fall into the trap of thinking that sex is casual. We don't have to think too much about it. There's no big deal about it. But that's also where we need to correct the views on sex, because I think sex is in fact very powerful and it is very significant. It is how great civilizations come about, and it is still the reason why mankind exists today, right? So I think laying this down and setting the record straight about what sex is, then we can move on to talk about what sex is for, right? So here we're exploring the purposes of sex. Am I right,
That's
Joshua?
right, yeah. We are exploring the purposes of sex. I do agree with you. It's important to lay that understanding that sex is really for procreation, create new life. And obviously, there's the pleasure in a sexual relationship as well. But you are correct in saying that I think that's something that we have put aside at the expense of having pleasure and, making it casual. We have put aside a very important aspect of sexuality, which is procreation. And I think it's important for us to lay that foundation first and foremost. Then they are able to see the importance and the purpose of what sex is all about, right?
Absolutely. And this is something that we don't hear very often in our culture today and the media. So it's good that we're talking about this. I think for me, when I talked about what sex is, what sex is for with my son, the number one purpose that I make sure to talk about is in the context of marriage. So if you ask the question of what sex is for, then my answer to him would be sex is for marriage, right? The reason why sex is for marriage is because it has such an ability to form deep bonding and a permanent, complete union of the husband and wife, not just bodily, but also emotionally and mentally. It is an act which requires both the husband and the wife to be fully naked, literally and figuratively, with each other, right? Because we can be vulnerable with our spouse and be assured that we are not in danger. So that's the meaning of sex in the context of a marriage. And I remember reading before that the hormone released during sexual intercourse called oxytocin, it is also known as a kind of bonding gel between a husband and wife, right? And this chemical is responsible really for forming that special bond. It strengthens the quality of marriages. And so it is a precious gift that I think husbands and wives steward, especially knowing that it has the potential to bring forth new life. And it is only with a stable and loving marriage that this new life would be best cared for, would be best nurtured. So I think we need to help our children understand this. And of course, I say this knowing that it also depends on the age of our children and the vocabulary range of our children. I like to use an example that I've learned from Focus on the Family, actually. The peanut butter and strawberry jam sandwich analogy, a husband and wife, right? So if we think about the side of the bread with peanut butter as the husband and strawberry jam on the bread as wife, when we put the two together, and this is exactly the same thing that happens during sexual intercourse, there's exchange of body fluids. And so once you put the two together, you can no longer go back to the original state that they were in. And that exchange of body fluid is exactly like how the peanut butter mixes with the strawberry jam. And that just brings the two together to form a very yummy sandwich. Of course, in the context of husband and wife, we're not saying we can be eaten that way. And I find this very helpful. This example is so helpful, so effective for little children to understand that sex binds two persons together. And that bonding, that union is best illustrated and best represented in the form of marriage.
I mean, sex is pleasurable. We need to acknowledge that. But it's also so powerful, right? Because the potential of creating new life, it is there. And that's what sexuality is. And I cannot imagine sex being outside of the context or the boundary of marriage, because the bonding is so strong and a husband and wife become so vulnerable with one another. So imagine this in the context of a non-marriage, being so vulnerable with one another and not knowing whether you'll still be together. I think that really impacts, a relationship. And I think that's why it's important for us to help children to see, right, and understand the connection between sex and marriage as well as family. Do you have any other thoughts on how do you explain the purpose of sex to our children?
So that brings me to the next purpose of what sex is for. And again, within the context of a marriage, it showcases the beauty of man and woman's binary, complementarily created bodies. Because let me ask you this question, Joshua. Have you ever realized that all organs and systems in our body are made in a way that's independent and whole in and of itself, starting from the cellular level, except for one? You can make a guess. So this system that is in our body that is not yet quite complete on its own, and that's a reproductive system.
That's right.
Right. So it is the only part of our body that is, like I say, not quite complete on its own. So if you think about the vagina, it's designed to be joined together with a penis. And a penis is also designed to be joined together with a vagina. Especially the more we learn about biology, we know that the reproductive system was not created to be by itself. It is meant for a complementary joining of man and woman. And I feel that this is a fact that deserves to be emphasized again and again, right? Because nowhere in life is the purpose of our differently sexed bodies more evident than the beauty of man and woman's binary, complementarily created bodies. And it draws us to the reality that there are inherent differences between men and women. Even as culture today is big on gender equality and particularly female empowerment, I think our kids benefit from us still holding on to some inherent differences and not ignoring the reality that we're different in some ways. And it could start from us naming the different parts of the male and female body. And I remember doing this for my son when he was just about 5 or 6 years old. And at that time, compared to my peers around me, they were quite surprised that I did it so early on. But
at what age we're talking about?
5 or 6. He was 5 or 6, right? And I remember at the time I thought, I missed the boat. Actually, I should have done it earlier. But then there are friends who actually haven't done it. So it's quite subjective that way. But regardless, I think naming the different parts of the male and female bodies helps build a good foundational understanding for our kids on what it means to be human. Because I would say there is no age too early to start this with. And for parents ourselves, we are the primary educators of our children when it comes to sex ed. And I think we need to act like it. And the advantage of having such conversations early on in our kids' life is that they'll be better equipped to cut through all the confusion of our surrounding culture and then be able to remain grounded on what's true and beautiful.
What advice would you give, for parents, right, who gets a bit squeamish, when they have to go about teaching about body parts? What would you advise parents?
You have to be able to articulate it without shame.
Grow thicker skin, right?
Yes, if that's possible. This is something that I initially struggled with because I think it is not easy to talk about parts like vagina and penis and still keep a straight face, especially knowing that it is not so much a social norm within society. We tend to stay away from such terms because there is a perception that it's shameful to talk about it, it's private, you shouldn't talk about it at all.
Or we use labels, right? I use fruits and whatnot to describe it, and that doesn't help either.
Yeah, exactly. I think we need to be factual in the terms that we use. We don't want to use, like you say, terms that cover up the accuracy of the body parts that we're referring to. So I practice this with my husband. Okay? We would just use it. If there's a need to refer to that particular body part, we would just use it as it is. And over time, you'd be surprised. Actually, it can be normalized. You can normalize using terms such as vagina and penis in the home. And what better place to use it than at the home where there is safety, where there is the secure love that parents have toward their children. It's the best place to use these terms.
Exactly. It's just like teaching our children, right, about, where the nose is, where the eyes are, And we were talking about, having this whole idea of sexuality education at a younger age. I think one of the things that I always realize, right, that parents, don't give themselves enough credit because they always feel, okay, I don't really do that. I can't do that because I don't have enough knowledge or not brave enough. But the reality is that parents are already doing some form of sexuality education. For example, when they teach their children on hygiene, when they teach our children how to, bathe themselves. And so all these are part and parcel on sexuality education. So we can actually use moments like this, right, to actually bring in the correct vocabulary of naming body organs, to help our children to be comfortable. And what this does is really to take the shame away from the topic of sexuality and to actually help our children to also develop a positive body image as well when we call it for what it is. Right? Do you agree on that?
Absolutely, Joshua. Thanks for mentioning that. This is something I will take away from today's session and share it with my friends who have young children. This is so useful because everyday moments can be capitalized on for us to carry out sex ed. It doesn't have to be a sit-down serious talk about sex ed. It can be lighthearted, it can be fun, it can be engaging, it can be relevant to our everyday moments. So that brings me to the third purpose I share with my son about what sex is for, and that is for the making of fathers and mothers. Right. And this is related to what we said at the very beginning when we're trying to set the record straight, what sex is, because sex has the power to bring forth new life. And this deserves to be emphasized again and again, right? New life meaning babies. And where there are babies, there are fathers and mothers too, right? And contrary to what we hear and see from media and culture today, I think sex isn't primarily about self-pleasure. Although we did acknowledge that there is pleasure in sex, it can be pleasurable. And the pleasure is what strengthens our marriage as well. It is the only act that can bring about a continuation of generations, and so it is an act with a significance that's larger than ourselves. It would follow that once husband and wives have babies, they would take on new titles. For the husband, father. For the wives, mother, right? And both of which are life-changing roles. I think we know also that fathers and mothers play different but essential roles in parenthood, so neither is replaceable. But of course, not all children come from intact families. So we do want to prep our kids by cultivating empathy and understanding in them that when they speak to others who may not come from intact families, they are speaking lovingly, yet also truthfully. Because the truth is that children are best cared for and raised in a stable, loving family with their father and mother. And I believe that truth and love can go together, and they should go together.
We talk about the different family dynamics, right? I think you have pointed out something very important, is to actually help our children to see the important role of father and mothers and to be able to have empathy for those who actually don't come from the same family dynamic as they do. We also acknowledge that there are single parents out there. How would you advise them, especially in explaining the topic of the meaning of sex and the purpose of sex for parents who are doing this alone with their children?
My message would be, don't do this alone. Get into a community. It can be from a church community, it can be from social communities, any communities that consist of parents just wanting to do what's good and what's right for their children. Get together, find other single parents who also go through the same struggles with you. I think, first of all, single parents have such a huge burden on their shoulders. Don't try to do this alone because you, first of all, want to be taking care of yourself, your own headspace, making sure that you have the ability to give and to sow toward your kids with regards to conversation on sex. And then once you're plugged into a community, you're supported. I think the next step then is to look for trusted male figures who will be able to speak powerfully and truthfully and safely into your child's life.
I think that's so important. I think that's a very, very big message because community is a very important aspect. Regardless of whether you're a single parent or not, I think the community aspect is still a very important aspect. Thank you so much, Michelle. I mean, this is really comprehensive in the sense of how can we approach, right, on explaining, the purpose of sex to our children. In your own experience, when you try to unpack some of these concepts at home, right, have you ever met with resistance, or what would your advice or tips be for parents who meet such resistance of, children begin to show you a different facial expression or even run away, for the matter of fact? How would you advise parents who face resistance when it comes to having to explain some of these concepts at home?
Personally, I have not met with resistance because I've got a very curious boy who won't stop asking questions. So I actually have the other end of the problem where, I need to draw a line because if we go on and on and on, right, then I wouldn't have time to make dinner anymore. I think for parents whose children might be coming across with some resistance, the first thing to do perhaps is to read the atmosphere, the timing, the readiness of our kids before launching into any such conversations about sex. The good news is I think we are the best people to read these things because of our proximity to our children. So I think firstly, learning to use opportunities as they come along on a day-to-day basis to talk about sex, because I think that's a very good leverage that we can use, and I'm beginning to appreciate the mileage that can come from having consistent mini talks as opposed to once in a while heavy and long talks about the topic. So it has helped us to reduce the initial awkwardness that comes from just mentioning the word sex, especially if you have school-going children. They might have already heard the word from their own peers without you mentioning it at home. And I think one of the things that my son picked up quite readily was that when the word sex is mentioned, it's,
there's a lot of echo in the room.
Exactly. Yeah, we want to reduce the perception that is not so nice to talk about because sex is something real. And it's something that is needed in order to bring forth new life. That's why they're here. They came because of the process of sex, right? It means that we have to make it natural and help our child to see the relevance and the importance of having a correct view on sex. And I'm not advocating against intentional long talks with our children about the topic. They serve a meaningful purpose in a child's life as well. And it's a great way for children to continue this back and forth exchange of information with their parents. I'll give you an example of how we were able to capitalize on everyday opportunities. We were on the train, okay? And there was this Magnum advertisement. Magnum is an ice cream brand. You might have eaten it at some point. So the tagline on the advertisement is this. It says, "Wherever pleasure takes you." And my son immediately picked that out. And we had a long conversation following from this. So he was telling me, "Mama, that doesn't sound right." And I said, "Yes, I'm so glad you pointed it out." Because, well, let's talk about what pleasures there are in life and what are the possible wrong places that we can get into if we follow just pleasure at the cost of everything else, you know. And we were able to talk about how if we were to just pursue sex as a form of self-pleasure, we might possibly be looking at a lot of broken families, right? We will be looking at children born out of wedlock as well. So there are a lot of repercussions that can come from just following pleasure. So this is just a quick example to show you how from everyday moments, we were just traveling on MRT with no expectation that we would come across such an act, right? So from there, we were able to have a sex ed talk. And it's so beautiful, and it's something that engaged him right away because it's visual, it's right in front of him. And he was curious to find out more. And it was just so natural. It was like a streams of consciousness just flowed and flowed and flowed. We were able to talk about it so much from an advertisement.
Exactly. I mean, I'm so glad that you are able to capture those moments. And I think those moments exist. We just have to be aware, really intentional. I mean, your son is really inquisitive, right? And so the question is, you know, what if they ask touchy questions, you know, like, hey, mommy, you know, I've heard my friends talking about oral sex. What is all that about, you know? On touchy questions, how would you deal with those questions?
Definitely, there have been tough questions asked at home as well. And here, I want to say that I want to confess that we didn't manage it very well at the start. Okay, so I haven't had the question on what is oral sex. I had something else which I cannot remember now, but I remember it sent us into a fluster. And then we had a long talk with my son. And then it took us also a few days to continuously address it with him, to apologize to him as well that, "Mama, Papa, sorry that we overreacted when you told us this. It's because we care so much about you and we don't want you to go away with any wrong understanding of the subject of sex." But if I were to get a question and, you know, having been through this struggle before and having to apologize and make up and do damage control with my child, I would say that maybe the first step is really to not overreact. This is something that takes a lot of training and practicing in order that we keep our emotions under our management. So this is where I think as adults, we need to have self-regulation. We need to know when we're being triggered and to know what to do when we're being triggered. It is okay to say, I need space to process my thoughts. Now, I'll get back to you at another time when I'm calmer, because to respond or react to that moment in time could cost us our relationship with our child at some point. So I think first step is not to overreact. And the second step would be to ask clarifying questions. Establish some facts about where your child heard it from and what do they already know about it. For me and my husband, we always strive to be factual and helpful with our responses. And that means to take into account the age appropriateness of our words, because we want to make sure that our son is able to digest the information in a way that doesn't rob them of their innocence. So a question like oral sex can be very visual. I mean, just talking about it. So we do want to simplify it to a level where there is accuracy, okay, about what it means, but at the same time, we're not traumatizing them. We're not feeding them with unnecessary vivid details about what it means.
That's right.
So I would suggest to state what is sex for first, what is sex in the first place, and perhaps depending on the age of your child, really, and the vocabulary range of your child as well, we could then say, well, oral sex is not the true standard of sex, that it deviates from what sex is about and what sex is for. And the word oral does means the use of mouth. So we're not using our body parts as they're intended to be, as they're designed to be. Okay. So I'll keep it at that. Because I do think that it provides some accuracy, but not overfeed the unnecessary information.
Yeah, I think that's so important. I mean, I like the fact that you are talking about, even for parents who have overreacted, and they have to backtrack, right? And I think our kids, just would appreciate that. Yes, our parents don't have all the answers, but at least they are courageous enough to admit that and to be able to have those continuous conversation, and especially on difficult ones, not one-off, right? It's continuation. Yeah, so anyway, thank you so much, Michelle. I think we really blessed to have so much information and insight on this topic. Thank you so much for sharing your tips and insight. I really resonate with the whole point of having to share with our kids about the purpose of sex in the context of marriage and family. And I think that's a really good foundation to start us off with. And of course, having to deal with difficult questions. And I'm sure many parents struggle same way as all of us do. And having to be able to, like you say, right, to regulate our own emotions, to be able to apologize when we give a negative reaction or even a misinformation, to be able to auto-correct, go back and correct those information. I think this is really important. So before we conclude, could you just share maybe, a final piece of advice or some words of encouragement for parents listening to us right now?
Absolutely. I think there's no running away from the topic of sex in the culture that's very sexualized today. Yeah. If you're not talking about it at home, then we can be assured that someone somewhere else is talking about it, either directly or indirectly with our children. But at the same time, I also think it's encouraging and comforting to know that there are wonderful resources such as Let's Talk About Sex series that you amazing people at Focus do, that you have created and made available for parents who need support to do so. I guess I'll leave with parents are the best people to talk about sex with their children. And there is support and community available for these parents. So I think to any parents hearing this, whether or not you've yet to start, but are thinking of starting, or you have only taken baby steps so far, I applaud you for wanting to try. You are not alone in this. So do look around for friends who share the same values that you can journey with, and find your community, and let's talk about sex at home.
Thank you so much, Michelle, once again for the insightful thoughts we have discussed today. So for those of us listening in, we trust you have gathered plenty of practical tips and valuable insights on today's conversation. We want to encourage you to visit our Talk About Sex micro learning website at family.org.sg/TAS videos. So as always, we hope you found today's conversation helpful. Please share this episode with a friend or a parent who you think might also benefit from this. So until then, stay tuned for our next episode.